Welcome to Spiritual Steps, a podcast about learning to pray, listen, and grow by taking small steps on the spiritual journey. I'm your host, Stephen Hovater, and this is episode 24, Read the Gospels. Immerse yourself in the life of Jesus. The four books of the New Testament that we call the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they tell the story of Jesus, and they offer a rich source of spiritual nourishment. And for centuries, they've been at the very heart of the church's faith. That life of Jesus, what he taught, what he did, the way the kingdom of God broke in to the world during his time. And it's an amazing set of stories. It's a remarkable thing that they even exist, and especially in the form that they do, these Gospels. They're kind of like this weird literary thing. You know, we could really easily only have one narrative, and I guess that would probably tidy up some of the questions that New Testament scholars pore over all the time. But count me among those who celebrate the differences between the authors, the diversity of these stories, because I think they open up different windows into the life of Jesus. They tell the story in ways that, bring out different theological emphases and which evoke new and different and unique questions. I love Mark's abruptness and the urgency that comes with it. I love the way that John holds his cards about Jesus' core teachings until the very end of the story. I love Luke's radical reversal and the way Matthew throws ethical bombs. And I love the craft with which the narratives are put together so that the contexts are... They bring about these new ways of seeing particular episodes in the life of Jesus, and they put different kinds of color, theological color into the story. See, each of these, they contribute a unique witness to Jesus. Each one of them does in its own way. And in the same way that each of us, in our own way, creates a unique testimony to Jesus in the way that we tell and live out Jesus' story in our own world, in our own context. So, here's the deal. This practice that I want to offer you in this episode is to simply immerse yourself in the reading of the Gospels, or really one Gospel at a time at least. And if you can, I want to encourage you to try reading one of the Gospels in a single sitting straight through. Take Matthew or Mark or Luke or John, block out enough time, and just read it cover to cover. Now, depending on which one you choose, and they are different lengths, of course, it may take somewhere between, depending on how fast you read, maybe as quickly as 45 minutes, 30 minutes, maybe, if you're really flying, to maybe, an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours, I think probably at the most. The other day I read Matthew cover to cover. It's 28 chapters long. I think it's the longest one. It's the longest in chapter count. I don't know about word count. And I was reading it, and it took me right at about an hour, okay? Now, depending on how you do it, you don't want to try to rush it, so just give yourself time, though, okay? Try to block out a piece of time, maybe up to 2 hours, okay? Maybe even give yourself like a little break in the middle if you need to, okay? And just cover to cover, read one of those stories. Now, here's the deal. This is really different than the way that we usually experience the Gospels. I kind of joke around that instead of the Gospel according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, we typically know the Gospel of the blender. In other words, we kind of take these four pieces of work, which really are unique literary creations, and we throw those things into a giant blender, and we read the stories without any sense of where they came from. So we kind of read a piece of Matthew or a piece of Mark. We know a teaching from John or a sentence or two from Luke. And sometimes those stories kind of exist in multiple forms in the other narratives, okay, in different stories, and sometimes they're unique to the one that we're reading. But we miss the uniqueness because what we know is we don't really know the Gospels. We know the Gospel in general terms. We just kind of have this cloud in our awareness of the stories about Jesus, okay? So we can kind of say, this is where we know that Jesus tells a story that's like this, right? Like people ask me, well, doesn't Jesus say a parable like this? And I say, yeah, that's right. But what's really hard to pin down, I find that people that are usually like even very, very biblically literate, they'll have a really hard time pinning down which of the Gospels they're talking about, okay? In which one that particular story or that line or that teaching occurs. And to me, the Gospels are maybe as hard, especially Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are as hard as almost anywhere else in the Gospel to do, or in the Scriptures to do that, with maybe the exception of the Psalms. Man, I can't remember for my life like which Psalms are which. You want to find like a line. Like, come on, there's a number labeling. It makes it really difficult because there's not as much of the narrative storyline in the Psalms. However, when we're talking about the Gospels, the problem isn't just that there's no narrative storyline. Obviously there is. The problem is that there are these parallel ones. And so trying to figure out which Gospel we're talking about any particular section of the story or teaching or whatever is just really confusing for a lot of people. And we don't really experience them that way. We typically experience them through a Bible study or a reading or devotional time where we just have these. We just encounter these small pieces of text, these fragments. And so what happens is we read that thing, we absorb it during worship, and we kind of upload it into the big general cloud of our knowledge about Jesus or our knowledge about the Gospels. And we have a really difficult time kind of parsing out which of the particular accounts, which of the versions of the Gospel that particular piece comes from, okay? That's the blended version of the Gospel. That's the blender version, okay? And that's the way we normally experience it. But here's the deal. When we do that, we lose out on a lot of not just context, literary context, but like theological context too, because each of the writers is trying to not just tell you a story about Jesus, but trying to teach you through that story. And some of that just gets kind of washed away when we take all the unique edges out of the stories, and when we take them out of the context in which they were originally embedded. Another thing is too that when you engage in this practice of like reading one of the Gospels like straight through, and you're able to kind of take all that context for a second, and the stories just kind of pop when they're in their context that way. I don't know how to describe why that happens, but when you're kind of reading them with all the kind of things that come before them or come after them in the context of each narrative, then they take on just different layers of meaning because they're kind of like they'll hit the same tones over and over again. Okay, like Mark will pick up certain threads in chapters 2 and 3 and 8, and you know what I mean. And it kind of just you start to recognize the tone that the authors are using, and it really makes a difference in the way that you read. And besides that, too, just the practice of giving yourself time, okay, that you're reading the Gospel over the sake of not just a few moments that you're meditating on a piece, but, that you have this extended time of reading where you're going to read for an hour or so. That gives you this kind of immersion into the story that you wouldn't otherwise be able to get. And it really provides a different quality of reading. And if that sounds like a lot, I'm just going to remind you, that if you look at the different pieces of story that we kind of often consume, and yeah, sure, I know we live in the culture where like you have things like YouTube, and you have like a 3-minute story or a 20-second or a minute long, there's all that kind of stuff. But it's also true that, we see movies all the time that are 2 hours in length, hour and a half, right? And I'm telling you, that you can sit down and in the same amount of time that you would watch a film, you can easily absorb one of these Gospels. And it might feel weird and different. It may not be your normal pattern of consumption, but you can do it. And when you do that, when you're immersed in the story that way, it'll be the kind of practice that can kind of open up new avenues for you. So listen, reading like this really has shaped my spiritual life. And I keep coming back to it. There have been times in my life where, you can't do this every day. You probably aren't going to be able to carve out a 2-hour period every day to do this, all right? But if you do it from time to time, you kind of return to this practice. It can really enrich your understanding of Jesus, okay? And it can call you out into new ways of following as a disciple of Jesus. Listen, I believe that this vehicle is more open to the church than we realize it is. I don't know why we've gotten to this impression that these things are meant to be read in small doses, okay? But go ahead, give it a try. Read one of them from cover to cover. Immerse yourself in the gospel of Jesus. I really believe that when you do, you're going to find that you are nourished in a new and in a deeper way. All right, that is it for this episode. So thank you so much for listening. Hey, if you're a regular listener, then you might have noticed that it took a little longer between episodes this last time. The difference between 24 and 23 was about 6 weeks ago at this point. And that's because I was working hard on an academic project. I'm so glad to say that I finished that piece of the project and I got that monkey off my back. And everybody around me is noticing that I feel just lighter because of it. So thanks for being patient with me, and we should be able to regain the normal pace of releasing episodes now, so look for something again in about a week. If you have any comments or questions about these practices or just want to extend the conversation, then reach out on Twitter. My username is @StephenHovater, and if this is the sort of thing is useful to you, then go ahead, subscribe, whatever podcasting app you love. We'll be back soon with a new episode, and I wouldn't want you to miss it, okay? Until then, keep taking the next step in front of you, the next step that you see, and may God be with you on each step of your journey. Peace.